Chapter 2 Reason Unbound. Ancient Greece and Enlightenment America upheld human reason as a preeminent value. For each culture, that reality was all-defining. In the case of America, even the deadly action, or especially the deadly action to which her founders committed themselves, was pursued in the name of human reason. It was principled action. At its core, the defiance of the historical tyrannies of God and King was an intellectual defiance grounded on the principle of individual rights. This defiance, however, was not shared by the entire population, nor was it shared by all intellectuals. Some urged caution rather than outright revolution. But the Founding Fathers, passionate about freedom, ultimately prevailed. The strength of their convictions had a moral fervor that was unstoppable, and contrary to the opinion of some historians, it was shared by the great majority of the colonists and not merely by a minority group of radical intellectuals. Reason, rational thought, dedication to freedom carried the day and the period. They also carried the next great period. Another revolution was about to begin. This time, it was a peaceful one. America's Industrial Revolution. For the beginning of the story, we need to consider America's situation immediately after winning independence. The essence of it was this: America's survival was less than certain. As writers Nothaft and Klein put it, the economy was essentially a backward agrarian one, dependent on imports and supported by a meager population of barely 3 million. By contrast, England's population was 9 million. As they go on to explain, however, the new country had strengths. She had abundant, though untapped, natural resources and a population that doubled every 20 years, the fastest rate in the world. And this population, though relatively small and lacking higher education, was largely literate. Above all, as a publisher of the Times stated, it was a population imbued with a universal ambition to go forward. This, of course, reflected the optimistic Enlightenment mindset of the age. The founders, nonetheless, were faced with a great challenge. How should the new nation leverage its assets to best jumpstart a primitive economy? This was the question taken up by the Constitutional Convention as it began its proceedings in 1787 Philadelphia. To start, the founders looked to the patent system of England, the country then leading the Industrial Revolution. But as they looked, they quickly saw that England's patent system had limitations. Securing patents often depended on court connections, making them vulnerable to revocation or expropriation without compensation. Patent application fees were so high that only the wealthy could afford them. Laws limited the ability of inventors to sell or license the rights to their inventions. Thus, unless they enjoyed great wealth, inventors lacked the capital needed to commercialize their inventions. As economic historians Lamoureux and Sokoloff put it, the framers of America's patent system wanted to avoid such limitations. Instead, their vision was a patent system that would unleash the entrepreneurial energy of ordinary people. The 1787-1788 Constitution and the laws promulgated from it accomplished exactly that. It started with Article 1, Section 8, which declares that Congress shall have the power to, quote, promote the progress of science and useful arts by securing for limited times to authors and inventors the exclusive right to their respective writings and discoveries, end quote. A simple statement, yet it was revolutionary. It was the first time the Constitution of any nation included an intellectual property clause. The patent system that grew out of this revolutionary statement was exceedingly friendly to inventors. Lamoureux and Sokoloff Explain the dynamics. Patent fees were set so low that any ordinary citizen could afford them. Patent application procedures were greatly simplified. Examination of a patent application by technical experts for novelty and conformity with statutes reduced uncertainty about the validity and value of an invention. This made it easier for the inventor to sell or license his invention and thus realize a monetary return. From the first patent law of 1790, Lamoureux and Sokoloff continue, America's patent system included provisions explicitly designed to support trade in patent rights, and both the courts and U.S. Patent Office acted to facilitate such transfers. Also, enforcement of patent rights, they state, was assigned to the federal courts, where judges quickly developed an effective set of principles for protecting the rights of patentees and also of those who purchased or licensed patented technologies. Northaft and Klein stress that the promotion of patents as tradable assets was a wholly unique feature of the American patent system, spurring a dramatic rise in the per capita patenting rate. In 1865, they report, it was triple that of Great Britain. Even more dramatic was that by 1880, 85% of American patents were licensed by their inventors, in contrast to only 30% in England. Lamoureux and Sokoloff report that even as early as 1810, despite its lag in industrial development, the United States far surpassed Britain in patenting per capita. We need to pause and consider the significance of the new country's patent system. It cannot be overemphasized. It gave to writers and inventors exclusive right to their writing and their inventions. The framers realized that not only does writing involve intellectual property, but inventing does too. Writers have the copyright system to secure their intellectual property. Inventors have the patent system to secure their intellectual property. Laws promulgated from Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution accomplish this in each case. A patent once issued secures intellectual property in two ways. First, it legally certifies to the world that the inventor was the originator of the idea behind the invention. Second, the patent system protects his exclusive right to profit from that invention, to reproduce it, to commercialize it. This means that during the limited term of the patent, it would be unlawful for anyone else to attempt to do so. The impact of America's patent system on the new country was momentous. It was the first time in the history of economics that an ordinary person could make a living as an inventor. More than that, an ordinary person, simply by applying his reason and intelligence and street smarts, could become prosperous. The result was a riot of invention. Philosopher Andrew Bernstein concisely captures it. The 19th century in America, he states, was the single greatest era of technological and industrial advance in history. He points to the sewing machine, the steam elevator, the air brake for railroad cars, the telegraph, the reaper, skyscrapers, suspension bridges, the conquering of typhoid and yellow fever, the camera, the phonograph, the electric light, the motion picture projector. The 20th century, he continues, saw television and the revolution of transportation by automobile and airplane. Manufacturing was revolutionized by the method of mass production that brought modern inventions to millions. For each advance, there were ripple effects, triggering innovations in other sectors of the economy. All these marvels are simply a few of the highlights. Truly it was as if the new nation had been touched by the torch of Prometheus. America's Industrial Revolution was running full bore. If the inventive geniuses of the time are regarded as giants, as well they should be, there was another class of producer for which even that term is inadequate. Instead, we need the term reserved for the demigods of Greek literature, of whom Prometheus was one, Titans. To this day, This is the term applied to Andrew Carnegie, 1835-1919, steel. John D. Rockefeller, 1839 to 1937, oil. Cornelius Vanderbilt, 1794 to 1887, steamboats and railroads. James J. Hill, 1838 to 1916, railroads. Edward H. Harriman, 1848 to 1909, railroads. J.P. Morgan, 1837 to 1913, banking and finance. As is well known, these figures and a number of others were vilified in their lifetime as robber barons, and the period of American history they made possible invariably goes by the derogatory term Gilded Age. For now, however, I want simply to call attention to the Promethean nature of this cast of characters, for each, in his own way and in his own field, personified Prometheus. Each had enormous vision or foresight. Like Aeschylus's Prometheus, America's giants as well as the supergiants or titans were proud of their achievements and the quality of their work. Rockefeller, writing to one of his partners, remarked, "We must remember we are refining oil for the poor man, and he must have it cheap and good." James J. Hill, reflecting on his continent building, remarked, "We look back at what we have done and how we led all Western companies in opening the country and carrying at the lowest rates." We read such statements and think of Aeschylus's Prometheus, who declares, "None else but I first found the seaman's car, sail-winged, sea-driven. Such ways to help I showed them." The height of America's Industrial Revolution was roughly the period from the last third of the 19th into the early 20th century. Driven by titans of heavy industry and the inventive giants of lighter industry, America's living standard improved at an explosive rate. Historians differ in their evaluation of it, but not over the fact that it occurred. As economist financier Michael Dahlen summarizes, from 1870 to 1910, real GDP increased at an average annual rate of 3.97%. America had surpassed Britain as the world's leading industrial nation. During the same period, consumer prices actually declined at an average annual rate of 0.16%, while overall real wages in manufacturing doubled. Because the rates of improvement were annual rates, they were compounding. The improvement truly was staggering, titanic. As writer Alex Epstein reports, late in life, Rockefeller looked back and recalled, "We had vision. We saw the vast possibilities of the oil industry." He saw that his company had stood at the center of it and brought its knowledge and imagination and business experience to bear in a dozen, in 20, in 30 directions. Rockefeller did not stand alone. Each titan of America's Industrial Revolution possessed towering vision. Vision, that synonym of forethought, the literal translation of the Greek name Prometheus. Vision was the quality common to all inventors and innovators of the age, uniting them through their myriad endeavors. It was this vision that changed the face of America. Freedom and rights. What were the conditions that made possible America's explosive growth during her first century and a half? In a word, it was freedom. But to be precise, it was freedom in the Enlightenment sense of the term. It was freedom from coercive authority. The simple truth is this: America's business climate was one of freedom and respect for individual rights. America's revolutionary patent system was the great exemplar of that fact at its most elemental level. This was the level of innovation. But the same was true on a wider political level. America's Constitution provided a framework that made America's economy the freest economy in history by a large margin. As Michael Dahlen explains, In the first century and a half after her founding, America's economy was largely uncontrolled. The Constitution protected private property with Amendment 5. It established sound currency through Sections 8 and 10 of Article 1, and it prohibited states from erecting trade barriers with Section 9 of the same article. Additionally, Section 8 severely limited the government's power to intervene in the marketplace. Government's role in commerce was minimal, existing primarily to protect the right of voluntary trade, to prosecute any initiation of force, theft, fraud, breach of contract, copyright, and patent infringements, and to arbitrate honest disagreement. Other than the execution of such functions, government, for the most part, did not interfere. In short, America then was a different place from America now. There were no federal regulatory agencies to dictate how goods were to be produced and traded. Exceptions existed: tariffs, national banking, infrastructure improvements, but were, as Dahlin puts it, limited in scope and were accompanied by considerable debate about whether they should exist at all. Private entrepreneurs, he reports, built most roads and many canals. When state governments intervened in the 1820s to subsidize canal building, most of those canals went unfinished, generated little or no income, or went bankrupt. Post-Civil War, Dahlin continues, federal subsidies for the transcontinental railroads caused similar problems, as well as corruption. The most successful of the transcontinental railroads was James Jerome Hill's Great Northern, which was built without any subsidies or land grants. Contrary to the implicit premise of the robber baron slur, men of this time were generally free to deal with one another on the basis of voluntary trade, using reason and not its antithesis, coercion. It was such economic freedom that drove America's Industrial Revolution. As we saw with America's patent system, the framers could have established impediments to innovation of the kind seen in Europe. Instead, they consciously avoided them. They kept government out of the way of the inventor, entrepreneur, and basically limited government to one function only. That function, so clearly stated by America's founding fathers, was the most important of all. That function was to secure and enforce individual rights. In the case of a patent, it was an inventor's exclusive right to his intellectual property, the intellectual property underlying his invention. Reason Unbound. America is a product of two great historical movements. The first was the Enlightenment, covered in Chapter 1. The second was the Industrial Revolution, covered in this chapter. Together, these movements undergird and explain her founding and the shape into which she grew during her first century and a half. Both movements show us America lit by the torch of Prometheus. Together they demonstrate the power of human reason and thought in the shaping of man's world. They also illustrate the power of vision and of freedom. Reason truly was unbound in America during her first 150 years. The grand vision of the framers, coupled with the focused vision of individual inventors, provided the infrastructure for the towering vision of the business titans. Together, these three catalysts, the framers, the inventors, the titans, drove the greatest and most rapid growth the world has ever seen, truly spectacular growth. But there is more to the story. The Enlightenment was not to last in America. She remained the world's leading industrial power, but her original spirit was to change. America's history is a complicated history, a very complicated history. Zeus, Prometheus's nemesis, was not idle in America during her Enlightenment and Industrial Revolution.